In this video, we are going to look at HTML forms. Forms are used to collect data from the user for various purposes. You have most likely seen and filled out many online forms when registering or logging into a website, adding shipping information to an online order, or submitting a blog post. These are just a few examples on how forms are used. Looking at this example of a form here, we can see we have numerous areas to enter data. The places we would enter data are known as inputs. The adjacent text to these inputs are called labels. Let's take a closer look at this. Breaking this form down, let's first look at the text input. We can create an input using the input element and setting the type to text. When we save the page, we can see we now have a text field to input data. Now it's common to provide a label with input fields, so let's go ahead and do that as well. We do so by using the label element, and within the element we will add name, as the paired input will be used to accept a name. That doesn't mean a text input can only be used for names. That's just what we will use it for here. Let's save the file and open it up in a browser. We can see we have a text input with a label next to it, which clearly identifies this input field to be used for a name value. So we have an input field and a label for it, but we are missing a couple things here. One thing we need to do is wrap the elements we are going to use for our form in the form element, like such. The reason for this is that when we submit this form, the data is going to need instructions or directions on how to be processed or where to be sent. Those instructions can be provided in the opening form tag by using the attribute action. The handling of the data entered in the form is outside of the scope of this video, but for now think of it like this. The data entered into this form may need to be sent to a database once submitted. HTML is not capable of sending the data directly to a database, so instead we will need to pass the data from the form to another file that is written in a language that can communicate with the database. To do this, we would use the action attribute to assign it a value of the file name that the data from the form will be passed to. Again, this file will be written in a language that can first accept the data from our HTML form, then communicate with the database to process the data. After the action attribute would be a method attribute. Again, this is out of the scope of this video, as this all pertains to a programming language not covered in this series. But essentially, when we send this data to the other file, we'll need to provide details on whether we want to get data from the database using this form, add data to the database using the form, update data from the database, or delete data from the database. For now, we'll say we are trying to enter data into the database, so we will assign the value of post to the method attribute. Don't think too much about this, just know that post is used to enter data into a database. Alright, now we can get back to talking about HTML. So as mentioned previously, there's still some things missing from the form that we should include. We'll add an ID to the input element, and since we are using this input to store a name, we will assign the value name to the ID attribute. Now we can go to our label and use the for attribute and assign it a value of name so that the two elements will now be properly paired. This is not mandatory, however it is good practice as it is used by screen readers to enhance user experience for those with visual impairments. Now let's add a placeholder attribute with a value of enter name. When we save the file and reload it in the browser, we see the effect of the placeholder attribute. Notice this placeholder text goes away once we begin to enter our own text in the input field. We'll add one more attribute to this input field and it will be the attribute required. This attribute does not need to be assigned a value. This attribute will require the user to provide text in the input field and will not allow the form to be submitted if it is empty. To see this, let's add a button element to submit the form. We can use the type attribute and provide it a value of submit. By assigning it the value of submit, the action attribute of our form element here will be triggered when the button is clicked. Note that by default, the button element's type is already submit, so technically, we don't need to explicitly declare this button of type submit. In fact, it's better practice to leave it out if we don't absolutely need to include it. Alright, so now that we have that button, let's save the file and reload our page. If we press the submit button with the name input field empty, we are prompted to fill out the field, and when we put some text in the field and click the submit button again, we can see we get a file not found. That's because the submit button triggered the form action, but since the file name we used here doesn't really exist, we get the error. If this file did exist, the contents of that file would be executed. That covers the basics of how HTML forms work and why you would want to use them. Now let's look at different types of input types that can be used with forms. First, let's look at an input field of type email. This input type is useful for emails as it requires the user to enter a valid email. Let's add the input field along with a label for it, save the file, and refresh our web page. Notice if we enter an invalid email address, we get an error. but when we enter a valid email address and submit the form, we can see the form does submit. Now let's look at an input field with type password. Notice when we type into this field, the inputted text is masked by dots so shoulder surfers can't see someone input a password. Another input type is checkbox. Checkboxes should be assigned an attribute of value. Whatever this attribute is set to is what will be sent to the action file here when we submit the form. So if we check this box and this box, when we submit the form, the values 1 and 2 will be submitted. Notice we are able to select multiple values using checkboxes. This differs from radio buttons. Let's create some input fields of type radio. Like the checkboxes, we will add the value attributes to the radio inputs for the same reason as the checkbox inputs. Now, one additional attribute we'll add to the radio button inputs is the name attribute. We'll assign the same name value to all the radio buttons. This guarantees only one radio button is able to be selected. If we were to remove the name attribute from the radio inputs, we can see that we can select as many as we want. This is not what we want, as radio buttons are used when we want the user to only select one option from those available. So we'll go ahead and re-add the name attribute to all the radio input fields to ensure only one value is selected. An alternative to radio buttons is the select element. Within the select element, we use option elements for all values that can be selected. As with the radio buttons and checklist, we want to give the option elements an attribute of value so that when the form is submitted, the value of the selected option will be submitted. Some other input types are date and file. Using the date input type, we can see a calendar is clickable to allow us to select a particular date. We can also input a date manually. Using the file input type, we allow the user to select a file from their computer to be uploaded whenever the submit button is clicked. The last input type we will talk about is reset. An input with type reset appears as a button that when clicked resets all form data. There are more input types that I recommend you explore to make sure you're using the input type that best fits your need. I'll provide a link in the description that has a list of the various input types.